Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio is Dr. Taya Cohen. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks.
So, Dr. Cohen is working on something really interesting. She is a professor of organizational behavior and business ethics at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. But as we've been setting up this interview, something that we wanted to discuss is some of her new work dealing with moral awareness, guilt proneness, and everything else she's working on. But before we dig into that, do you want to give us a background about who you are, what you're working on now, and how you got here?
Sure. I'm Taya Cohen. I am in the area of organizational behavior at Carnegie Mellon University. I've been here for 14 years now. Before this, I had studied social psychology, and so that's how I got into this field. I had done my PhD at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at the time I was studying intergroup conflict and trying to understand why when people interact as part of a group in an intergroup interaction, they're much more competitive, less cooperative than it's a one-on-one interpersonal interaction. And through studying that, it got me into studying morality and different moral norms. And fast forward to today, many years later, I'm still kind of thinking about these topics and figuring out why some people behave ethically, some people do not, and what are the antecedents and consequences of that.
Mm-hmm. So you recently have came out with a new scale that you're working on. It's the guilt proneness scale. Do you want to walk us through what that is and what application that is going to have? Because obviously, I think all of us, throughout our lives, we make good decisions, we make bad decisions, we feel, guilt when we do bad things that we shouldn't. But it seems like in the world of personality traits or in the world of, individual differences, it seems like the guilt proneness may be captured maybe in a different facet. So I didn't quite realize before I started looking at some of your work that it may be more distinct than, some of these other personality factors. So do you want to walk us through what guilt proneness is and how that's applicable to your work?
Sure. So you mentioned recent, although it's maybe more long-standing, as I published my scale, the Guilt and Shame Proneness Scale, or the GASP, in 2011 in a paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and I had been working on the topic for a few years before that. Um, so the I'll kind of back up and talk about sort of how I became interested in this particular character trait. And so when I was studying intergroup conflict, we wanted to understand how moral norms might differ in different contexts, intergroup versus interpersonal. And we wanted to understand sort of how do you study morality? And so the insight my advisor, Chet Insko, had was, when people act unethically or immorally, they might feel guilt, they might feel shame. And so we decided in some of our experiments to start measuring guilt and shame using some of the existing measures. Uh, Turns out that there's different ways of conceptualizing guilt and shame, and there's these very different scales at the time. The Tosca by June Tangi was one. There was another measure called the DCQ, and they use very different conceptualizations of guilt and shame. With the dominant measure at the time, the test of self-conscious affect, the guilt was defined as a thinking so a negative behavior evaluation. So it's thinking I did something wrong and associated with wanting to repair for that. And shame was thinking of yourself as a bad person. So I'm a terrible person, and then wanting to hide. And that was sort of the distinction. But then there was another measure out there, another work that had taken a more public versus private distinction, with shame being experienced when your transgressions are publicized and guilt being more in private. Uh, so this scale development process, which I started working on as a graduate student back in, I'd say, 2005 or so, along with Scott Wolf, who was another doctoral student in the lab, and a couple of our professors at UNC, Abigail Panter and Chet Insko. We started looking at all the measurement properties of these different scales and found out that even though these scales had different conceptualizations of guilt and shame, they actually were very highly correlated. They predicted similar things. And there was this important difference between guilt and shame, with guilt being associated with more moral behaviors. And the key part of that seemed to be a negative behavior evaluation, thinking that you did something wrong and then wanting to correct for it. And so, I don't know, fast forward, we did some measurement studies and decided we wanted to try and integrate some of these different conceptualizations. And that is what led to the GASP scale, which we published in 2011. And guilt proneness in that scale is conceptualized as a trait that captures the extent to which a person would feel bad about their behavior if they did something wrong, even if no one knew. So we use private transgressions. And we think of this as a character trait as opposed to an emotion because it's asking people to anticipate how they would respond in different situations. Like you receive too much change in a store, the sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood you'd feel uncomfortable about keeping the money? And people could say extremely unlikely to extremely likely. And then shame, on the other hand, is about negative self-evaluations associated with more public transgressions, like you give a bad presentation at work. Afterwards, your boss tells your coworkers it was your fault that the company lost the contract. What's the likelihood you would feel incompetent, right? So it's this more global negative evaluation. What's interesting about this research and why all these years later I've continued to study guilt proneness is because it predicts behaviors in people's lives, consequential behaviors. So we can ask people sort of 5 of these silly sorts of questions, and then 3 months later see how they're behaving at work in terms of committing counterproductive work behaviors that harm people. Are they going to lie to their classmates in a negotiation role play, economic decision-making task? Are they going to lie for financial gain? And more recently, as you mentioned, I've been thinking about how guilt proneness affects honesty among law students and lawyers, and some new work about the ethical considerations people have with the use of AI-powered tools, with the key insight that individuals who are higher in guilt proneness are more likely to consider the ethical implications of their behavior in choosing to use AI-powered tools, right? They have more ethical considerations about the use of new technologies, fits with this conceptualization of guilt proneness as tightly associated with a person's sense of personal responsibility.
So let's talk about that. So why would someone perceive AI usage as unethical? Because AI tools, ChatGPT really came on the scene 2 or 3 years ago. Seems like everyone's using it now. Either they're using Google Gemini or they're using ChatGPT. I use ChatGPT all the time. But why would someone perceive that as unethical?
So I think this is with new technologies, it's a space where we're all just figuring things out, and there's lots of potential concerns. And it's not to say that using tools is unethical or wrong. It's just there's lots of different considerations people might have. So some of the ethical considerations, if you kind of look at news reports or in some of our own data, you might have questions about bias, sort of algorithmic bias. Issues about transparency or a lack thereof in terms of the data sources or how the decisions, privacy issues, confidentiality, plagiarism or academic integrity, copyrights, accessibility, who can use these tools, who's included in sort of the data sources, and that again is related to bias. There's some concerns about the power of the big tech companies like OpenAI have in our society and sort of who's running these companies. Some people are concerned about that. And then, of course, a big one is environmental impacts with every time we run a prompt in ChatGPT or in sort of an image generative AI software, it uses a lot of energy and then, of course, has an impact on the environment. And so some people are not thinking about these issues at all, right? They're just going to use the tools because it can help our work and our productivity. Other people are very concerned. You go on social media, you will see the whole gamut of people saying we need to stop using these tools, right? They're harming society. And then others saying, this is the future. We should embrace the new technology. And so I think there's a lot of different considerations and sense making that we're all doing about figuring out what's the right way that we feel comfortable with personally to use these tools. And then companies, of course, are trying to navigate this as well.
So you introduce sense making. So obviously everyone's going to have a different conceptualization of what's right, what's wrong, how they can use something. Do you want to walk us through what sense making is and also maybe introduce us into what's called this character lens hypothesis that you are working on?
Sure. So Um, when we enter a new situation or have to make a decision, we first have to kind of figure out what is this situation, what is this decision, what's the right thing to do here, what considerations are important, are ethical considerations important, financial, strategic, environmental, legal, right? There's all different kinds of considerations a person might have. With a project I've worked on with Eric Helzer and Young Jung Kim, we introduced the idea of the character lens. And the character lens holds that sense making is a part of a person's character, right? And guilt proneness is one example of a character trait. And that provides a lens through which people filter the world around them. It focuses their attention and consideration on certain features of the situation that they encounter in their lives. So we hypothesize that individuals who are relatively higher in moral character, so guilt proneness, or you can think of other traits as well, like moral identity or honesty and humility, various different character traits. When a person is relatively higher, they're more chronically aware of ethical issues and the implications of the situations they face. And it's this greater moral awareness that influences their decision making, and that's going to have downstream impact on people's decisions and behaviors. Yeah.
Hmm. So, what specifically from this perspective is someone going to take from AI? So, is it someone who's high in moral awareness, or someone who rates higher on the GAF scale? Are they going to take into consideration some of these issues dealing with AI usage, such as confidentialities, copyright, plagiarism issues? Because when I really started using ChatGPT, we saw stories of how some Fortune 500 companies, especially those dealing with sensitive information, really didn't let their people use AI because, there were privacy concerns. Where was the data going? Are they going to use that in their models? I also saw other things like there's this thing I saw online. It said the usage of the word delve. If I think it's on Google Ngram, if you chart it up until the uses of ChatGPT, the second ChatGPT came out, delve increased, X-fold just because ChatGPT uses it a lot. We're going to delve into this subject. So there are things we see, just in the broader environment of people not wanting to use these AI tools. But for an individual, is it people who are high in, this moral awareness and this guilt proneness? Are they going to be the ones who are more aware of these potential issues when working with AI?
Yeah, that's the idea that people who are higher in guilt proneness, they have a stronger sense of personal responsibility for the decisions they make. There's greater awareness of how their own decisions might affect other people, might affect the future outcomes. And because there's this sense of personal responsibility and this greater awareness of how their actions affect others, it will lead to more awareness of the potential issues that using new technologies could bring. But that's not to say that people who are high in guilt proneness just have an aversion to new technologies or to AI. And so my doctoral student, Sofia Rodriguez Chavez, we've collected data over this past summer from 200 people where we presented them with a vignette about using an AI powered tool to write a report. And we asked, what are the considerations that you would have? And what we see there is that the individuals who are relatively higher in guilt proneness mention a variety of different considerations, but are more likely than others to mention potential ethical considerations. But that's not to say that the people higher in guilt proneness are saying they wouldn't use the tool. They're just saying, here are the things I would think about. And I can tell you some of the quotes from the respondents in the survey, but basically we can group them into ethical concerns about their values. Would this be honest, or could this be a concern about using the tool without permission? Is that like cheating? Is there plagiarism issue? Am I taking credit for work? Is there harms to society? Some people are thinking that these tools are dangerous and toxic to certain sectors of society, and thinking about these issues at a high level way about not just the immediate decision, is it going to help me get my work done faster or not, but what are the implications, and do the benefits outweigh the cost in terms of the ethical considerations versus gains in productivity or efficiency. And so it was interesting reading the responses to this survey just to see how are people thinking about these issues? What's top of mind? And similar to what you highlight, some people are not thinking about these issues at all. Like, yep, if it's allowed, I'm going to use it. Other people are thinking pretty carefully about sort of how they would feel about it. Would they feel ownership over their work or not? Would it help improve their workflow? And importantly, is it ethical or not based on their own standards?
So I want to keep diving into this idea of guilt proneness, but something that I thought about when I was preparing for this interview is I obviously guilt proneness and having a heightened sense of interpersonal responsibility is going to have positive benefits, but could there be negative benefits, almost a too much of a good thing effect, where if you are so focused on guilt proneness, if you're so high in guilt proneness where you're almost paralyzed by, I don't want to say toxic perfectionism, but kind of this idea where you just don't want to do anything because there's going to be negative consequences to that. Has that been something that's been explored, kind of the negative side of this good or this positive thing?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So guilt proneness and shame proneness are connected, right? They're positively correlated. And once guilt starts to bleed over into shame, so once it's not just I made a mistake, but I am a bad person or flawed in some way, then that tends to be associated with much more negative outcomes. So just kind of acknowledging responsibility for doing something wrong, feeling guilty is not it's a very uncomfortable. We don't like. It's not a good feeling, but it is important for regulating our behavior and doing better in the future. So guilt proneness tends to be associated with more with positive characteristics that would be more helpful for well-being, but whereas shame proneness tends to be associated with things that would be more negative for well-being, like depression or rumination. And so keeping the focus on sort of a specific behavior, and then meaning you can change your behavior in the future, that tends to be more beneficial. But sometimes we've done something and we feel so that we might think is so wrong, and then we start to feel this sense of shame, which tends to have more negative consequences. The other side, or an additional way guilt proneness, could be too much, is you may not reap benefits that others with sort of less of a conscience might have. So in one paper from 2014 with Scott Wiltermuth, we had a paper titled "I'd Only Let You Down." And it's about guilt proneness and avoiding interdependence when you could free ride on the contributions of others. So what we did in that study through a series of studies was looking at whether people who are high, relatively high versus low in guilt proneness would be willing to link their outcomes to someone who is performing better than them. Like imagine you have a classmate who's doing great in their accounting class. Would you want your grade to be sort of average with their grade? And so people who are lower in guilt proneness are like, yeah, that would help my grade. Sure. People who are higher in guilt proneness are like, no, I wouldn't want to negatively impact my classmate, even if it means I did worse. So kind of an example of free riding on others' contributions. And so in that sense, there's a negative outcome for the individual, not taking advantage of an opportunity, not wanting to partner with someone who could potentially help them. Because they would be concerned that they wouldn't be doing their part, right? Again, that sense of personal responsibility. To the extent that that's miscalibrated, right? If you actually could help your partner, but maybe this guilt proneness holds you back, I could imagine that having some negative consequence. But I would say in all the data I've collected over the years, with at least how we are operationalizing guilt proneness, how we're measuring it, it's more of a linear effect with positive outcomes. But that's not to say that once it kind of gets to the extreme and becomes something closer to shame, or that there's some outcomes where maybe it would be better for the person to not hold themselves back from an opportunity, then maybe there could be some negative outcomes there.
Mm-hmm. So you are a professor, you're someone who's doing a lot of research. Do you currently teach right now?
I do. Yeah. So my main area of teaching is a course called Managing People in Teams. It's a course on organizational behavior. I teach that to all our full-time MBA students at the Tepper School. I also do a PhD seminar on similar topic on organizational behavior. And a lot of my executive education is in the area of negotiations and conflict management, which I taught for sort of my first decade here at Carnegie Mellon. I taught our MBA elective on that course, but I still do have a number of speaking engagements and executive education programs in that area.
So we're talking about the, guilt proneness. We're talking about the usage of AI power tools. As a teacher, how do you feel about the usage of AI tools? That's something I've had to grapple with at our university, because came on the scene, and it seems like when I'm grading, we use Canvas. We have integrated tools that account for plagiarism. We started experimenting with some tools for AI recognition, but those tools seem to be very imperfect. There are a lot of false positives. And, I've had to grapple with a lot of ways to do this. I used to do an assignment where people had to interview a manager and they'd submit a paper, but I'm trying to be creative and introduce new projects. Like, I actually had them record a podcast this semester because it's a lot harder to have AI do your podcast for you because you have to use your voice. Now, I know there are tools out there that can do voice and do all that now, but for now, I thought that would be a fun, kind of different way to mix things up. But how do you go about accepting or rejecting AI usage in your courses?
Yeah, this is the sort of very timely and the topic in higher ed right now. Briefly on the podcast, I was just introduced to Google Notebook, which apparently we have a subscription here at Carnegie Mellon, which can just make podcasts. You can just upload a paper and it makes a podcast of two AI agents talking about your work, which is pretty interesting. Okay. So how do I feel about AI and education? I think there's tremendous opportunity. And here at Carnegie Mellon at the Tepper School, for example, we have the Center for Intelligent Business, which is a new center we have that's funding a lot of internal uh, grants for faculty members who want to develop AI tools for their teaching. Lots of different AI coaches, ethics debate coach, or to practice your presentations and give you feedback. So in terms of teaching, I think there's tremendous opportunity to give individualized feedback with the use of AI tools in a way that's not feasible or scalable with, for most of our current methods. But of course, there's lots of problems. I'm facing the same issue as you with my course, thinking about what are the assignments that would be least tempting to use, generative AI tools for writing, doing a case analysis like I used to have, where typical kind of Harvard case analysis, it's very easy and tempting for students just to kind of use AI to generate that sort of report. And so I've moved into trying to focus more on reflection papers, things like that. It sounds like you've done that with the interviews. And I would love to hear if you find some good assignments, because my goal in teaching is to set clear expectations about what's acceptable use and what's not. And then also design assignments where the students are not going to be as tempted to use these tools, and also give them the opportunity to really analyze things in a way that they can do it better, or it's more interesting for them than simply using the tool for some kind of standard case that AI can clearly provide sort of good to, and even better in the future analysis of. So in terms of I was thinking, we thinking about my course policies, and I find it acceptable for students to use AI tools for editing. So like Grammarly, especially we have a lot of students who are not native English speakers. I think these tools can be beneficial, but I say that it is unacceptable use for them to use it for content creation. Right. And then if they're using the tools in any way for editing, for example, then they need to cite that and say sort of what they're doing and how they're doing it. You mentioned there's these checkers, and just like with any other unethical behavior, I don't see AI as particularly different in that in the past, before AI, students could go on the internet and find some material and copy paste, and the checkers could find that maybe more easily, but there's going to be a lot that's missed. And so there's, unfortunately, often going to be some small subset of students that will go down that path. But I think that's not the majority of students. I think the majority, vast majority, sort of want to act in a way that is consistent with their values and not go down that path. And so making very clear about here's what's allowed, here's what is not. If you're using these tools for editing your work, then make sure you're citing it. And in that case, if there is, a flag that comes up in one of these plagiarism checkers or things like that, then it should be very clear and say, well, I used it in this way versus not. Um, but I can say even before AI tools, I, as an instructor, had to deal with cases of students, copying things from the internet. And, they're generally poor quality assignments because if they're just copying and pasting information from the internet about, effective teamwork, it wasn't a particularly strong analysis. But AI may make that a little harder to detect. But, I think we can do things as instructors to maybe encourage better behaviors and set clear guidelines on it.
I have a similar policy as well. So obviously the finished product should not be ChatGPT output. It should not be, whatever AI output you're doing. But if you want to create an outline, if you want to help it critique arguments, if you want to help it as a tool, I think that's acceptable. But obviously, if you're doing a discussion post, if you're doing something, it should not just be that complete output. So I think a big concern is, are we having, AI generated content from students being graded using AI, and it's just back and forth interaction where, it's almost like let's go back to paper, let's go back to oral, let's go back to exams where we don't even use things on the computer anymore. But also, we don't want to not use AI tools at all because they seem to be around and they seem to be only increasing exponentially in their capabilities and everything. So if we want students to be able to have a competitive advantage in the market, they're going to have to be able to use these tools. So obviously, I think it's something that all of us have to grapple with.
Yeah. And the big question I've been thinking about, which does have some ethical considerations, is sort of when in the process people use these tools, students or otherwise. And the one danger, I think, is when a person goes, when you have the blank page, which is the hardest to figure out, what do you want to say? Where do you start? And I think there's a real temptation just to go to AI for that. The problem there, one potential problem, is then we become very anchored on whatever that initial output that's provided. And that hard part that involves a lot of learning and trying to figure out, what's the key point you want to say, that can get circumvented. And then the learning gets, it's not as deep, right? If we're using AI in that beginning part of the process. And so I've been thinking about, how do we feel about using AI in the beginning of a task, especially a written task, or other kind of maybe creative work, versus later on when it's more on editing, and sort of when do we get the most learning, and and also then the long-term impact. If we use AI, then how much do we become dependent on it? And so people who have expertise now that they've developed through sort of the hard way, the more manual way, how can we ensure in the future we can inculcate this expertise and teach people when there is a temptation to kind of start in the middle, right? If you start with AI, I think there's this leveling effect where it's better than the poorest performer. It's not as good as the best. I think that's demonstrated now in a lot of domains. But how do you learn, when you're a novice or a beginner, to develop that expertise if you kind of start in the middle with the mediocre output that a generative AI tool might give?
So we've been talking about AI usage in general. AI usage seems almost maybe from undergraduate context, but in your doctoral courses and maybe in the world of research, are you seeing the usage of AI tools as acceptable? I know there's a lot of software popping up, but do you see that as acceptable as researchers, maybe helping with, finding citations, things like that? Have you seen any usage of AI tools? Do you use AI tools when doing research at all?
So I have a paper under review now with Sudeep Bhatia, who's a cognitive psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, where it's actually a paper on using generative AI, ChatGPT specifically, to demonstrate that it can code written text at a level similar to a trained research assistant. And so this is sort of a project about AI in a way. And that is about sort of the psychology of situations and trying to understand what a situation is. And there's some data sets that had been coded by participants in prior studies, and we're showing that ChatGPT correlates very highly with those codings, and then we can then move that to scale. So I think for research purposes, that's going to be one direction, given what we're seeing in our work, and then others I'm sure we'll find similar, where some of the manual coding tasks can be automated through generative AI tools. But in terms of finding citations, I mean, I'm sure people are doing that. I'm not sure how accurate because we know about the hallucinations. I have not kept up with, all the different tools and which ones are better or worse. But, there's at least now it's been a couple years, I think, the cases of like a lawyer being sanctioned for trying to find cases and it was just hallucinated information. So I don't know that AI is a better solution than, say, Google Scholar or just a traditional search engine or any of the databases available through a university library. Is it tempting for people to use it when it gives you, results back? Probably. And is it valuable? I don't know. That's not a use I have done, although I think others have. And so I can't speak to that. So I'm not using these tools very much in my own work. Although now that I'm doing research in this area, I'm dabbling a bit. So I just tried the other day and I went to write an abstract for a presentation. And it turns out it was a PowerPoint presentation that I have presented. I've given actually several times. So I had the presentation, but I had never written a abstract, a 200-word abstract for it. And so I uploaded the presentation, some other descriptions or notes I had, and then I think I was using Google Gemini and Microsoft Copilot. Those are ones we have access to through Carnegie Mellon. Anyway, I was kind of seeing like how would it write an abstract? Is it better or worse than what I would do? And I'd also written some notes on it. And so it was, I think, of the 200-word abstract or so, there was one sentence I sort of liked how it had phrased. Most of the rest of it I wasn't so impressed with, but yeah, thinking about uses like that where you have a whole manuscript and you need to then summarize. I think there's certainly these tools seem to be good at those sorts of tasks, and so that's one of the few uses that I personally have found at least somewhat helpful. I don't know. I spent a lot of time just trying to tweak these sentences. When I'm like, was this actually helpful? I was just more curious about how the AI would digest my work, but I don't know that it actually saved any time because I kind of kept going through without, to get one good sentence out of it.
Mm-hmm. So that'll be something really interesting. So I finished my dissertation. Technically I finished at the beginning of this year, but it's been done for a year or so. But when I was in the middle of my dissertation, ChatGPT first came out. I looked for citations relevant to servant leadership and social loafing. That's what my dissertation was on. And it gave me 3 citations on that exact issue. And I was like, oh no. But my study's been done, and it had the full citation, Journal of Business Ethics, JBR, JP, wherever it was published. I went, didn't exist. So that gave me a
Wow.
heart attack. So luckily, that was just one of the hallucinations where it didn't actually exist. So I think there is going to be an issue with that, but I actually use it all the time. So I enjoy listening to podcasts, and I'll oftentimes listen to historians or whoever, and they'll do these long 2, 3, 4 hour podcasts, and I sometimes don't want to do that. But if they talk about something specific, well, I'll actually go online, and there are these websites that will summarize YouTube videos for you. So I'll take a 2, 3 hour podcast, I'll summarize, and I'll say, hey, do they talk about this? And then if they do, I'll go to that specific timestamp. So there are usages for AI, but that's the thing. We're all going to be working it out. We're all going to be figuring out as it goes on.
Yeah, and that's why taking this person-centered approach that I do in my research, thinking about what's the role of the individual in making sense in these considerations and how much are they going to fact check, to this example you had, which is a fascinating one, and you caught it early. You're like, okay, I'm going to use this tool, see what it gives me, but I'm not going to just rely blindly on it. I'm going to consider, and do some checking. And there's very little guidance right now in terms of, either from the universities or then regulatory guidance is going to be far behind the technology. And so the role of the individual, the character of that person and other individual characteristics, I think are going to play a big role in shaping how people interact with these tools.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back. Let's come full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning of the interview. So we're both studying organizational behavior. You're a professor of OB and business ethics. So if I'm a manager, how is guilt proneness, moral awareness relevant to me? Because this is Psychology of Business podcast. I want to kind of frame it back to, how's this actually applicable? Let's take it from the academic domain and let's talk about real world applicability.
Yeah. So most organizations will say that they value ethics, honesty, now whether that's true in practice, I think is debatable. Some people have different opinions, but if you at least go by, most organizations would like a workforce of individuals who are more honest. They're going to work hard. They'll be productive. They'll feel a sense of responsibility and accountability. Um, Traits like conscientiousness, and being sort of working hard on tasks we know are valuable for organizations, and guilt proneness is associated sort of with this sense of responsibility, with being conscientious, with working harder, with not doing disruptive behaviors in the workplace, stealing things, spreading gossip, rumors, all these more negative kinds of behaviors. So I think from that sense, um, it's important for organizations to hire people, promote people who are higher in guilt proneness. Um, I think there's certain industries where I know over the years I've had many discussions and inquiries for industries that really prioritize this. If you think of um, areas where there's a lot of safety risks, so nuclear energy is one, and so I've been in conversations with staff members of the Department of Energy for many years because they do a lot of psychological testing already, right? They need to know whether employees who are handling nuclear materials are, risk at behaving irresponsibly, and guilt proneness is one character trait that I think is important there. And then, it's not just these kinds of occupations where safety is a real risk, but I think more generally, any organization that would like their employees to be more responsible, relatively more responsible in their work, then that guilt proneness would be beneficial. And so not just my work, but I would say Frank Flynn at Stanford and Rebecca Schomburg at University of Pennsylvania have some great papers where they've studied outcomes like absenteeism, showing that for employees who are relatively low in guilt proneness, if they're dissatisfied with their job, they're much more likely to be absent, not show up. Whereas for employees who are higher in guilt proneness, if they're not satisfied with their job, they still show up, right? This, again, the sense of responsibility. They have some other paper on leadership showing that individuals higher in guilt proneness are rated as more effective leaders. Again, that sense of responsibility seems to be driving it. So I think there are important implications for organizations, um, and kind of thinking about on the hiring end and the selection, but also like who do we promote and where is it important to highlight and make sure people who are higher in moral character are more prominent in the organization to kind of set those norms in the culture.
Can we train people? I know guilt proneness is a moral character trait, but is there anything we can do to emphasize that? Or I don't want to say make people feel more guilty, but is there anything
Yeah,
we can do to help that? Because I know there's
yeah.
ethics training, there's all the different trainings we do, but because this is a trait, is that something we can influence at all? Because if I, do work, nuclear might be a special use case where you need, just the top of the line people. But, in day-to-day work, is there something I can do to move the needle a little bit to have people be more aware of this? Not necessarily to make them feel bad and shame, but just be more aware of their actions and the consequences of them.
I think so. I think so. I think of a trait simply as an adjective that we use to describe people. We use it to describe ourselves, others. Guilt proneness describes our behaviors, but it's not. And there's some stability over time. Right? You can measure. I've measured at one point, and so it's um, relatively consistent, but it's not fixed. And then we know there's this strong trend for age, a strong positive trend, and that means people's guilt proneness increases over the lifespan, right? It's up and through older adulthood, similar to other kinds of moral character traits where people mature as they get older, which means that there is potential for growth. I think all of us, on average, do. We start to understand the consequences of our choices. Different life events. Um, so character can change and does change over the course of a person's life. And then there's more deliberate efforts. So I think of personality and moral character like a habit. When I teach, I often will say, I'll ask people to fold their arms. Okay. And then I'll ask them to kind of fold them the other way. And that second way kind of feels much more awkward, but we can still do it. Right. The first way is sort of our natural way of behaving. And so Um, I think of character like that, we can make a deliberate choice to act differently, and then we can build new habits. It often requires us to be mindful of the decisions we're making. And there is a fantastic new paper I read yesterday by Isaac Smith and colleagues at BYU. Here's the paper. It's an Academy of Management review, and they call it moral character development, the moral moments model. And and this is all about how character might develop in a more agentic way. Basically, if a person has these experiences they call moral moments where they have some recognition in either a positive way or a negative way. So either dissonance where they're uncomfortable with their choices, or resonance where it's something they want to do more of, that these moral moments can powerfully sort of shape our sort of moral identity, our sense of self, and through these different choices we make at particular times and our reflection on them, that can change our character in somewhat fundamental ways. Um, but also a lot of the time we're just sort of acting on autopilot, so we need to kind of recognize um, the choices we're making, the impact we have, and we can of course make different choices if we wanted to change our character. And so kind of thinking about character change on the one sense, there's this consistency where we develop these patterns, and if a person wants to change, they can. I think they're through a more deliberate process. The challenge for organizations is how might we influence positive character development in others. So if I'm a manager and this is important, sort of what can I do? So I think we can change people's choices, and we can change people's moral awareness, making people kind of frame how we frame the issues, how we talk about issues. Over time, a person's sort of character might be shaped in a more positive way or a more negative way, right? If you're in a sort of toxic organizational culture. Um, but character change, often there has to be a role of the individual themselves, I think, wanting to kind of go in a particular direction. It can't be forced, but people's behaviors can change, right? Even if you're not changing a person's sort of character, um, you can certainly shape their decisions through how issues are framed, for example. And are we talking just about if it's with new technologies, are we talking just about the gains for efficiency and productivity, or are we start thinking about the broader implications, the long-term implications of the choices, how different decisions would affect others, and through the leadership, through the culture, the climate of the organization, I think we can guide people towards more ethical considerations and potentially more ethical behavior. Um, and then maybe character change follows. But there has to be some, I think, recognition on the part of the individual to really implement that character change.
That's fascinating. I'm excited to see what comes out of this line of research, what you're going to be doing in the future. But before we end, I want to turn the lens onto you a little bit. So you're someone who's gotten a degree of professional success. You're a professor at Carnegie Mellon prestigious university. You've been published in media outlets. I'm looking at your bio right here. It says in 2020, you were recognized as one of the best 40 under 40 MBA professors. So congrats on all that. But one question that I ask everyone is, what advice do you have for someone if they want to be successful? Obviously, your industry is higher education and research and conflict management, everything like that. But what advice do you have for someone who's trying to be successful, either as a researcher or just in general, one of your students?
Well, thank you for the question. I Lately I've been thinking about sort of research and what we do and why we do it. And so the thought I have had lately that I've communicated to my doctoral students and others is that quality stands the test of time. And I've been thinking a lot about, now that I'm at this stage of my career, about sort of the impact of my work and then what's important. And I've gotten some nice emails somewhat recently about work I had written a long time ago. There's one paper, for example, from 2006, and I got this email from a student in Turkey, like an undergraduate student, part of a psychology club, and they had read my paper and it sparked all this discussion in class. And they wanted me to come speak to their class, which I'll do in a week or two. And it was interesting to reflect on about how we, when we're working and when I was starting out, we're just kind of working on this paper. And I'm thinking, I'm writing this paper when I was 25 years old. And then here it is, like 20 years later, these students on some other part of the world at a university that I was not familiar with, it had inspired a discussion and for them to, really think about their world or lives maybe differently, or at least discuss some of the ideas and how it related to them in their lives. And then if you contrast that with some of what is going on in the field of organizational behavior, there's been some high profile retractions and some social scientists under investigation for potential integrity issues with their research. And, thinking about the implications of that, and when there's so much pressure in academia as well as in most other industries to just produce and to publish and to, whatever it is in any career, just to, get results. And when you take the long view, a lot of that work may not stand the test of time, and so thinking, I have the luxury of saying this now because I've achieved a degree of success, but I think thinking really carefully about um, the doing high quality work now, I think sets you up for success in the long term. And it's so difficult to keep that focus on in the moment when there's all the pressures. And through studying guilt in particular, what I've realized, we had one study where we asked people to write about something they'd feel guilty about, something that they'd harmed someone in the past. It was a project with Jennifer Jordan and Frank Flynn. And reading these descriptions was one kind of difficult. My colleague Jennifer Jordan read them all, but what was striking to me is people could write about these events from the past, from long ago, and when they think about them, it stayed with them in a way that if they would think about these events, they still felt guilty about it, even though it could have been 10 or 20 years later. And so thinking about advice and what I've learned from my research on guilt, and also thinking about the impact I want to have, is sort of recognizing that we make these choices every day. We're making choices about the kind of work we want to do, where we want to focus our attention. And when we consider that the choices we make now have a long-term impact on the person we want to be, and the legacy we might have, and the contributions we want to make, that might lead us to focus on sort of quality over quantity, or really thinking deeply about something rather than taking the choice that in the moment might seem a little easier, but overall is not the highest quality. And thinking about new technology is one example. We could get the result that's fine using the generative AI, but is that going to stand the test of time? Is that the work at the quality that is important to us? And so I'm not sure. That was a sort of long-winded for advice, but taking the long view might be the shorter version of that statement.
Someone who's newly starting out in academia, I really appreciate that. There's all the pressure of publishing. It also depends on what type of university you're at. It depends on a lot of different things. So I appreciate your words and your insight.
Oh, good. Well, good luck. And hopefully you can find the area that you're passionate about and want to keep studying for a long time, and kind of build those contributions. And I guess that would be the other piece that I've realized over my career. It's been shaped. It wasn't just like one project, but now looking back, sort of there's this series. And to me, I studied questions that were interesting, and that, one question led to another, and kind of building that program of work by doing research on topics that I thought were important to answer, even if it wasn't the one that was the most natural fit for a top publication, but it's one I thought was important. And then over time, I've been fortunate where that work has been well received. But when I was just starting out, it was so uncertain, right? And so kind of having that sense of self and trusting your own judgment is really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Taya Cohen, professor of organizational behavior and business ethics at the Tebber School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
If people want to see more of your work, how do they find you?
Well, you can Google me, Taya Cohen. I think the only one that I'm aware of. So I'm at Carnegie Mellon. You can find my professional website through there, and with links to all my papers. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much for watching. You have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you.